And we're continuing with The Mystery of Marie Rogêt by Edgar Allan Poe. Dupin has whittled it down to the idea that it could not have been a gang who murdered Marie Rogêt, and we will pick up from there. And again, I have already mentioned the suspicion to be excited by the fact that the articles in question were suffered to remain at all in the thicket where discovered. It seems almost impossible that these evidences of guilt should have been accidentally left where found. There was sufficient presence of mind, it is supposed, to remove the corpse, and yet a more positive evidence that the corpse itself, whose features might have been quickly obliterated by decay, is allowed to lie conspicuously in the scene of the outrage. I allude to the handkerchief with the name of the deceased. If this was an accident, it was not the accident of a gang. We can imagine it only as the accident of an individual. Let us see. An individual has committed the murder. He is alone with the ghost of the departed. He is appalled by what lies motionless beneath him. The fury of his passion is over, and there is abundant room in his heart for the natural awe of the deed. His is none of that confidence which the presence of numbers inevitably inspires. He is alone with the dead. He trembles and is bewildered, yet there is a necessity for disposing of the corpse. He bears it to the river, but leaves behind him the other evidences of guilt, for it is difficult, if not impossible, to carry all of that burden at once, and it will be easy to return for what is left. But in his toilsome journey to the water, his fears redouble within him. The sounds of life encompass his path. A dozen times he hears or fancies the step of an observer. Even the very lights from the city bewilder him, yet in time, and by long and frequent pauses of deep agony, he reaches the river's brink and disposes of his ghastly charge, perhaps through the medium of a boat. But now what treasure does the world hold? What threat of vengeance could it hold out, which would have power to urge the return of that lonely murderer over the toilsome and perilous path to the thicket and its blood-chilling reconciliations? He returns not, let the consequences be what they may. He could not return if he would. His sole thought is immediate escape. He turns his back forever upon these dreadful shrubberies and flees from the wrath to come. But how with a gang? Their number would have inspired them with confidence, if indeed confidence is ever wanting in the breast of the arrogant blackguard. And of errant blackguards alone are the supposed gangs ever constituted. Their number, I say, would have prevented the bewildering and unreasoning terror which I have imagined to paralyze the single man. Could we suppose an oversight in one or two or three, this oversight would have been remedied by a fourth. They would have left nothing behind them, for their number would have enabled them to carry all at once. There would have been no need of return. Consider now the circumstances that, in the outer garment of the corpse when found, a slip about a foot wide had been torn upward from the bottom hem to the waist, wound 3 times round the waist, and secured by a sort of hitch in the back. This was done with the obvious design of affording a handle by which to carry the body. But would any number of men have dreamed of resorting to such an expedient? To 3 or 4 the limbs of a corpse would have afforded not only sufficient but the best possible hold. The device is that of a single individual, and this brings us to the fact that between the thicket and the river the rails of the fences were found taken down, and the ground bore evident traces of some heavy burden having been dragged along it. But would a number of men have put themselves to the superfluous trouble of taking down a fence for the purpose of dragging through it a corpse which they might have lifted over any fence in an instant? Would a number of men have so dragged the corpse at all as to have left evident traces of the dragging? And here we must refer to an observation of Le Commercial, an observation upon which I have already in some measure commented. A piece, says the journal, of one of the unfortunate girl's petticoats was torn out and tied under the chin and around the back of the head, probably to prevent screams. This was done by fellows who had no pocket handkerchiefs. I have before suggested that a genuine blackguard is never without a pocket handkerchief. But it is not to this fact that I now especially advert, that it was not through want of a handkerchief for the purpose imagined by Le Commercial that this bandage was employed is rendered apparent by the handkerchief left in the thicket, and the object was not to prevent screams, appears also from the bandage having been employed in preference to what would so much better have answered the purpose. But the language of the evidence speaks of the strip in question as found around the neck, fitting loosely and secured with a hard knot. These words are sufficiently vague, but differ materially from those of Le Commercial. The slip was 18 inches wide, and therefore, although of muslin, would form a strong band when folded or rumpled longitudinally. And thus rumpled, it was discovered. My inference is this: the solitary murderer, having borne the corpse for some distance, whether from the thicket or elsewhere, by means of the bandage hitched around its middle, found the weight in this mode of procedure too much for his strength. He resolved to drag the burden. The evidence goes to show that it was dragged with this object in view. It became necessary to attach something like a rope to one of the extremities. It could be best attached about the neck, where the head would prevent it slipping off, and now the murderer bethought him unquestionably of the bandage about the loins. He would have used this but for its volition about the corpse, the hitch which embarrassed it, and the reflection that it had been torn off from the garment. It was easier to tear a new slip from the petticoat. He tore it, made it fast around the neck, and so dragged his victim to the brink of the river. That this bandage, only attainable with trouble and delay, and but imperfectly answered its purpose, that this bandage was employed at all, demonstrates that the necessity of its employment sprang from circumstances arising at a period when a handkerchief was no longer available, that is to say, arising, as we have imagined, after quitting the thicket, if thicket it was, and on the road between the thicket and the river. But the evidence, you will say, of Madame Dulac points especially to the presence of a gang in the vicinity of the thicket, at or about the epoch of the murder. This I grant. I doubt if there were not a dozen gangs, such as described by Madame Dulac, in and about the vicinity of the Barrière de Roule, at or about the period of the tragedy. But the gang which has drawn upon itself the pointed animadversion, although the somewhat tardy and very suspicious evidence of Madame Dulac, is the only gang which is represented by that honest and scrupulous old lady as having eaten her cakes and swallowed her brandy without putting themselves to the trouble of making her payment. Et hinc ille aeri. But what is the precise evidence of Madame Dulac? A gang of miscreants made their appearance, behaved boisterously, ate and drank without making payment, followed in the route of the young man and girl, returned to the inn about dusk, and recrossed the river as if in great haste. Now, this great haste very possibly seemed greater haste in the eyes of Madame Dulac, since she dwelt lingeringly and lamentingly upon her violated cakes and ale for which she might still have entertained a faint hope of compensation. Why otherwise, since it was about dusk, should she make a point of the haste? It is no cause for wonder, surely, that even a gang of blackguards should make haste to get home, when a wide river is to be crossed in small boats, when a storm impends, and when night approaches. I say approaches, for the night had not yet arrived. It was only about dusk that the indecent haste of these miscreants offended the sober eyes of Madame Dulac. But we are told that it was upon this very evening that Madame Dulac, as well as her eldest son, heard the screams of a female in the vicinity of the inn. And in what words does Madame Dulac designate the period of the evening at which these screams were heard? It was soon after dark, she says, but soon after dark is at least dark, and about dusk is certainly daylight. Thus it is abundantly clear that the gang quitted the Barrière des Roues prior to the screams overheard by Madame Dulac, and although in all the many reports of the evidence the relative expressions in question are distinctly and invariably employed just as I have employed them in this conversation with yourself, no notice whatever of the gross discrepancy has as yet been taken by any of the public journals or by any of the memorandums of the police. I shall add but one of the arguments against a gang, but one has, to my own understanding at least, a weight altogether irresistible. Under the circumstances of a large reward offered and full pardon to any king's evidence, it is not to be imagined for a moment that some member of a gang of low ruffians, or any body of men, would not have betrayed his accomplices. Each one of a gang so placed is not so much greedy of reward or anxious of escape as fearful of betrayal. He betrays eagerly and early, that he may not himself be betrayed. That the secret has not been divulged is the very best proof that it is in fact a secret. The horrors of this dark deed are known only to one or two living human beings and to God. Let us sum up the meager yet certain fruits of our long analysis. We have attained the idea either of fatal accident under the roof of Madame Dulac, or of a murder perpetuated in the thicket at the Barrière des Roues by a lover, at least by an intimate and secret associate of the deceased. This associate is of swarthy complexion. This complexion, the hitch in the bandage, and a sailor's knot with which the bonnet ribbon is tied, point to a seaman. His companionship with the deceased, a gay but not an abject young girl, designates him as above the grade of the common sailor. Here the well-written and urgent communication to the journals are much in the way of corroboration. The circumstance of the first elopement, as mentioned by Lemercieux, tends to blend the idea of this seaman with that of the naval officer who is first known to have led the unfortunate into crime. And here, most fitly, comes the consideration of the continued absence of him of the dark complexion. Let me pause and observe that the complexion of this man is dark and swarthy. It was no common swarthiness which constituted the sole point of remembrance, both as regards to Valence and Madame Dulac. But why is this man absent? Was he murdered by the gang? If so, why are there only traces of the assassinated girl? The scene of the two outrages will naturally be supposed identical. And where is this corpse? The assassins would most probably have disposed of both in the same way, but it may be said that this man lives, and is deterred from making himself known, through dread of being charged with the murder. This consideration might be supposed to operate upon him now, at this late period, since it has been given in evidence that he was seen with Marie, but it would have had no force at the period of the deed. The first impulse of an innocent man would have been to announce the outrage and to aid in identifying the ruffians. This policy would have suggested he had been seen with the girl, he had crossed the river with her in an open ferry boat, and the denouncing of the assassins would have appeared, even to an idiot, the surest sole means of relieving himself from suspicion. We cannot suppose him, on the night of the fatal Sunday, both innocent himself and incognizant of an outrage committed. Yet, only under such circumstances is it possible to imagine that he would have failed, if alive, in the denouncement of the assassins. And there we will pause.